Soon.
Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We know that, unfortunately, after 8 years of bad economic policies from the Obama administration, working people did not receive a pay increase. We know that we had one of the lowest labor participation rates in modern history. We know that the economy was limping along at 1.5% to 2% economic growth, but fortunately, Mr. Speaker, a new day has dawned. And now, all of a sudden, we see that with the policies of Republicans in Congress, with policies of the Trump administration, we're seeing promising signs. What we're seeing all of a sudden now is two quarters, Mr. Speaker, of 3% plus economic growth. This means a difference to working families. They're finally seeing increases in their paychecks, increases in their take-home pay. And that is why one of the most exciting policies that are being worked upon today that we hope to see soon is fundamental pro-growth tax reform for the entire American economy. One that would grow our economy, that makes a tax code fairer, flatter, simpler, more competitive. One that would lower rates for families and allow 90% of Americans to fill out their forms on something akin to a postcard. Something that would help our small businesses and entrepreneurs. And I look forward, Mr. Speaker, to having that legislation on the floor soon. But we have legislation today that is also important to our small businesses and our entrepreneurs. H.R. 2201 by the gentleman from Minnesota. And what's so important about this legislation, Mr. Speaker, is that it would allow our entrepreneurs and our small businesses to more effectively be able to reach out to family and friends to get the needed capital to start their businesses. A 2014 survey by the Kauffman Foundation found out that over 28% of startups raise their funding from their personal network. But, Mr. Speaker, we have a challenge, and that is the Securities Act does not clearly define what is a public offering or, conversely, a non-public offering. So this makes it very difficult for our early-stage entrepreneurial growth companies to go out and do any kind of private to raise funds from friends and family. Now, we know that a private placement is already something that is established in law, but what isn't established is a bright line, safe harbor for these business enterprises to go out and raise these funds. And so what we also know, unfortunately, from our Securities and Exchange Commission, a registered offering is simply not economically feasible for a small business, an entrepreneur, an issuer who is seeking to raise less than $1 million. And so too often, Mr. Speaker, we have a number of these enterprises that frankly just never get jump-started because they don't have the opportunity for a private offering. And that's why it's so important, and I want to thank the gentleman from Minnesota, Mr. Emmer, for his leadership in bringing this legislation to the House floor today. And so it's a simple piece of legislation. Again, it simply allows a bright line, safe harbor for very, very small offerings. It requires that each purchaser has a substantive pre-existing relationship with an officer, director, or shareholder of the issuer. The issuer must reasonably believe that there are no more than 35 purchasers of the securities, and the aggregate amount of all securities sold by the issuer cannot exceed $500,000 in a 12-month period. So, Mr. Speaker, we're talking about a very, very small portion of startups, but a very vitally important section of our startups that need capital. You know, Mr. Speaker, a few decades ago, there was a company where a gentleman borrowed money from his father to import Japanese sports shoes, and he purchased 200 pairs of these Japanese sports shoes. He started a business called Blue Ribbon Sports, and today we know it as Nike. A few decades ago, there was an investor out in Omaha, Nebraska, who borrowed money from 7 friends and family members, including his sister Doris and Aunt Alice. And over the next 9 years, this initial investment grew, And this gentleman purchased something called Berkshire Hathaway, a textile company that has now led to the Berkshire Hathaway empire. In 1994, there was a gentleman who took a loan from his parents, moved to a 2-bedroom small apartment, launched a company called Amazon. We want to make sure that the next Berkshire Hathaway, the next Amazon, get launched, and that's why it's so critical we enact H.R. 2201, and I reserve the balance of my time.